Message I want to bring you this morning is entitled Standing at the Cross. Standing at the Cross. And the reason that I felt it's important to bring this message this morning is because over the past 40 days, as you know, or up until Friday, that we stood with the cross for 39 plus 1. And I want to thank everyone who came and joined with us, even if it was only for a few moments, those who stopped by just to encourage and so on, but those who stood day after day. And again, a very special thanks to Bucky, who never missed a day. Even when he was up all night looking after the homeless here on a Friday night and getting the men's breakfast at 9 o'clock the next morning, he was still out at the cross vigil for 12 noon. So I want to thank him, but thank every one of you for coming and for joining with us. It was truly an amazing 40 days of witness. And as Jonathan said, it's gone out. You know, when we think about that human peace wall, as we call it, I know that we didn't have enough people. There were lots of people who said they were coming but didn't turn up on the day. And some said they were bringing churches, bringing chapels and all sorts, and they turned up on their own. But anyway, we had a good turnout, a good enough turnout to make it all look so well. But not only to stretch between the gates and to go as far as we could, although some of you wouldn't leave each other, you're all huddled together. It's crazy. But we've stretched across the Atlantic and we've stretched across the Pacific. I've got messages from different parts of America, people saying that they saw us coming up on the news. And even two people from different parts of New Zealand contacted me to say that they had seen us on the news. They were simply watching the news and all of a sudden we came up on their TV screen doing the human peace wall. And so we'll stretch way beyond this place. And it reminds me of our own mission statement where we're the main part of it is to be a God influence to the city and beyond. And it's not about us, it's about influencing our communities and influencing our world with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And we believe that has helped us to do that. And Jonathan talked about moments that you look back on moments sometimes. You maybe don't think too much of the moments, but afterwards you look back on those moments. And I always look back to whenever Kathleen was reading the newspaper and called me to tell me the old stadium was being sold. That was a moment that turned into something amazing beyond that. And then I remember, good to see Jim McCauley and Maureen today. I remember Jim, and I mentioned this a few weeks ago here in the service. We were down in Townsend Street where we've been for a few years, and Jim came to me, I think it was one of the mornings, and he leaned over and he said, "Do you know that James E. Ball is for sale, the building?" And again, it was a moment, but it led to us actually buying this building and being here since 2009 and being an influence across the city and beyond. But we've stood with the cross. We've stood with the cross during those 40 days and the other times. But I want us this morning to not just think about the times that we've stood with the cross. I want us to think for a moment of what it must have been like for those who stood at the cross. Not just those who would take a piece of wood that looks neat and tidy and stand with it for a while, but to think of those who stood at the cross and at the actual cross and crucifixion of Jesus Christ. You see, when we stand with the cross or we carry the cross, we get to see John 3:16 on it. And we get to see the signatures of the places where it's been and the people who wanted to sign the cross in different places. We get to see what's on it. We get to see John 3:16. But they got to see Jesus on the cross. What they saw was entirely different from what we see, what we've seen. We see John 3:16. They saw Jesus on the cross. We were witnesses for Jesus as we stood with the cross for those 39 plus 1 days. Witnesses about him, witnesses concerning his love and his desire to reach out to humanity and to save. We were witnesses for Jesus, but they were witnesses of Jesus. They were witnesses of his broken bloodied body nailed to that blood-stained cross. We get to stand with a cross. They stood at the cross, and that's what they saw. We saw hand waves. We heard horns being sounded. Cars and buses and taxis passed by. That's what we saw. That's what we heard. But they saw the clenched fists. They saw the brutality. They heard the hateful screams of those who cried out, "If you are the Son of God, save yourself." He saved others, but himself he cannot save. And they heard the mocking and the sneers. And we would respond as people would pass by and give those little waves, and it made us feel good. But what they witnessed and what they heard was something entirely different. But who were they? Who were those who stood at the cross of Jesus? John tells us in chapter 19 and verse 25 that standing near the cross were Mary, the mother of Jesus, along with her sister. She's not named. Then there was Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. So we're told specifically of those few people who were there at the foot of the cross. And sometimes we think that that was it. That there were a few people who were isolated, cut off from everyone else, and they were left alone to be with Jesus in those last moments of his life. But then Luke tells us in 23 and verse 27 that a large number of people followed him and wailed for him. So it wasn't just the Marys, it wasn't just those who were close by, those few people who were there at that moment in time. Luke tells us a large number of people followed him. People who were touched by his ministry. People who were healed by him. Those who couldn't see could now see what was happening to him. Those who couldn't hear could now hear what was being said to him. A large number of people followed him and they wailed for him. Among that large crowd included family members. It included friends. Those who had stayed with him during those last hours of his life. And we all get to do that in life and as families. There are those moments when we just get to spend those last moments with our loved ones. Not with everyone, but oftentimes that happens in life. And that's certainly what happened with Jesus in terms of those who were with them right to the very end, being there to support him, being there to help in whatever way they possibly could. But this large crowd not only included family and friends, but it included the disciples. It included those who had walked with him and spent precious and significant time with him over the previous 3.5 years of his life. Although the disciples, they were keeping their distance. They weren't at the foot of the cross. They were keeping their distance because they were fearful and they were confused. They were fearful and confused because they believed they were following the Messiah. And they had an idea of who the Messiah was and what he would do. And their idea of the Messiah would be one who would bring deliverance to the nation of Israel and would bring destruction to their enemies. And at that moment in time, their enemy was the Roman armies, was Rome itself. They believed that Jesus was the Messiah and that he would cause armies to rise up across Israel and that they would defeat the Romans and that he would rule as their king. That's what the disciples were believing. Well, they had revelation as to who he was. Even Peter to declare, "You are the Son of the living God," the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of the living God. But they had their own perception as to what that would mean and what that would lead to. And now they've seen him being arrested. They've witnessed him being brutalized, been beaten to such a point that other men literally died under such punishment. And they're thinking, this is the Messiah. We expected him to be our king, to rule over us. And now the Romans have him. He's arrested like a common criminal. They have him beaten. Who knows that he's going to survive this? And now they see him being taken out to be crucified. And they're standing fearful and at a distance, being confused as to what really is happening here. And yet they were close enough to see what was happening. Close enough to hear all the stuff that was being said. Although there was one who got special mention, and that was young John. They believe that John, the disciple, he was in his teens. And that he was the one who stood at the cross of Jesus with the Marys. John, the disciple. There are those who believe that he was able to stand close to the cross without fear because of his age. Because those soldiers would simply ignore him as a boy, as a young man. It was of John that Jesus said when he spoke from the cross. He looked at his mother Mary and he said, "Woman, behold your son." And he was speaking of young John the disciple. And he looked at John and he said, "Behold your mother." In other words, from this moment on, you're going to look after my mother will be your mother. And even though he was dying his own death physically upon that cross, he was still thinking about the situations that were happening there at that moment in time. And that was of John he was speaking about. But of course, there were others who were there. It wasn't just friends. It wasn't just family. It wasn't just the disciples. It wasn't just those who had been touched and ministered to by him, whose lives had been greatly impacted by him, even healed. There were others, and others who were there for different reasons. You know, you very seldom get a crowd when everyone's there for the same reason. And that was the case here. A very large crowd followed him, but they weren't all wailing because of him. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John all mention the fact that the Roman soldiers were there, and of course they had to be there. They were carrying out the execution. They had to make sure that those who had been executed that day, that the executions were being carried out proper, and that those who had been executed would literally face death. And because it was a Jewish Sabbath, they didn't want those on the crosses to be there for several days. It's known that men survived on crosses literally for weeks. For weeks. And that's why they broke the legs of the two thieves. And when it came to do the same with Jesus, he was already dead physically. Because he had prayed that prayer, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And then he bowed his head and gave up his own spirit. And physically passed on at the cross. The Roman soldiers were there to make sure it was carried out and that they died. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all mention one particular Roman soldier and how that the crucifixion was to impact his life. And that, of course, was the Roman centurion. Matthew and Mark tell us that the centurion said, "Surely this was the Son of God. This man was the Son of God." Something impacted this Roman soldier, this hardened centurion who was responsible to lead 100 men into battle against the enemy. And now he stands and looks at what to them had been a criminal, one who's been put to death, executed as a common criminal. But he's now saying, no, there's something different about this man. Surely this man was the Son of God. Luke tells us the centurion said, "Surely this was a righteous man. Why is he even being crucified? Why is he on this cross? He is a righteous man." Of course, Matthew and Mark and Luke, they say slightly different things, but there's no contradiction here because The centurion probably said both of these things. In fact, he probably said a whole lot of other things as he stood at that cross, but enough to show how much he was impacted during those moments as he stood at the cross, along with others who were at the foot of the cross. And so there were women. There was a teenager. There was a hardened Roman commander and other soldiers who stood nearby, and some who were greatly impacted by what was happening at that moment in time, but it didn't impact everyone in the same way. And as we want to bring it home to us before we finish this service this morning, those who stood at the cross were impacted in some way, but not everyone was impacted in the same way. Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell us that the Jewish leaders were there also. But they were there for a different reason. They were the ones who hated and despised Jesus. They wanted to make sure that the Romans didn't back down, the Romans didn't back out, and that this man Jesus would face his end on the cross. That's why they were there. And we're told that the chief priests and the teachers of the law and the elders, they mocked him and they sneered at him. The tragedy is, we've even seen it in this nation of ours, that when a particular person dies, some may well mourn because of that person passing, others may well celebrate. And here were these priests, the leaders in Israel, and you would have thought that they would show some compassion. But no, they mocked him and they sneered at him. See, friends, the message of the cross doesn't touch everyone the same way. What happened that day didn't touch everyone the same way. And when we proclaim the message of the cross and we sing these great songs about it, it doesn't touch everyone the same way. There will always be those whose lives will be changed. And there was celebration in this place this morning as we sang about the blood of Christ, as we sang about his death, as we sang about his resurrection. There's celebration in this place, and we experience that celebration by those and coming from those who know that their lives have been changed because of the message of the cross and what took place that day. But then there will always be those who will mock and will sneer. And there will always be those who will just pass by, and it'll be meaningless to them. Maybe even appreciate the fact that Jesus died for them, but will just walk on by. But I wonder, friends, where you are this morning when it comes to the cross. Where are you in relation to the cross? Are you among those who screamed, "Away with him, we will not have this man to rule over us"? Or you mightn't say it in the way that those who cried that out said on the day. But you said in a way that says, you know what, I get on with my life. I do what I want to do. I don't need God in my life. I don't need Jesus in my life. Yes, good what he did and all of that stuff, but away with him. I will not have his rule in my life. Are you among those who mock and sneer? And we see it on Facebook. People mocking and sneering about even the idea of God. Oh, they'll come up with the things they found 650 million years ago and tell you, 650 million years and 1,503 days and 24 hours or 23 hours. And they can almost tie stuff down. But when we talk about God, they come out in the mock and sneer. And then sometimes they end up in church, whether it's Easter Sunday or whether it's a wedding or a funeral or something, but we end up in church anyway at some point in life. And so there will always be those who will mock and sneer. Or wonder you just among those who walk on by without even considering who this man was and is, and why it was that he was nailed to that cross. Or wonder you among those who have been impacted by its message. Are you among those whose lives have been truly changed? And I mean truly changed. Man, if we could underline those two words, truly changed. The Apostle Paul said, if any man is in Christ, he's a new creation. Paul doesn't say if any man or woman is in Christ, it's because they put the hand up in the church service and said a wee prayer. If any man or woman is in Christ, they're a new person. All things pass away and all things become new. And friends, I want to tell you this morning that the old things have not passed away. And if things have not become new in your life and you claim to be a Christian, then you need to take a very serious look at that claim. If anyone is claiming to be a Christian and the old is not past and the new has not come, you need to take a serious look at this claim, or your claim. Maybe this Easter Sunday morning, we need to examine ourselves as believers. We need to be prepared to say, you know what Jesus went through, he went through for us, and we're prepared to go through with him all the way wherever he leads us. But then I finish with this. How is such change possible? And worship team, you can come to the platform, please. We're going to finish in a moment. How is such change possible? How is it possible through the death of one particular person? Well, it is because of who he was and because of who he is. He was and is the eternal Son of the living God, who not only died for us, but thank God, he also 3 days later, after his death, he rose again from the dead, just as he said he would. You destroy this temple, he said. And there were things that Jesus said that they just didn't get at that moment in time. But when he was talking about the temple, he wasn't talking about the temple in Jerusalem. He did speak about that later on when he said, not one stone will be left standing upon another, and he prophesied how that Jerusalem would be literally invaded by the Romans and how that they would sack the city and destroy it and destroy the temple. But when he was speaking about this temple, he said, destroy this temple. And in 3 days, he says, I'll raise it up again. And the Pharisees are mocking, they're laughing. Oh, we destroyed that temple. He's going to build it in 3 days again. Didn't get it. So they thought they were destroying him physically when they put him to that cross. But we know, because we've seen beyond the story to where it led, that he rose again from the dead. And we also know that because he lives, we can live also, because it wasn't all left there. We can live also. And that's what changed everything for the disciples. Paul the Apostle said, he's speaking about the crucifixion of Jesus, but also of the resurrection. He says, if Christ be not raised from the dead, we are of all people most to be pitied. Because it wasn't just about the death. The death of Jesus Christ accomplished something in the heavenlies. It brought about the ability for redemption to take place. But if Jesus hadn't risen again from the dead, the cross would have been null and void. It was a demonstration of the fact that he truly was and is the Son of God in the fact that he rose again from the dead. Otherwise, everything he said would have been totally meaningless. And that's why we know that looking back on it, that even though the disciples were facing the situation of losing their Messiah and not understanding what was happening, they didn't understand because they were so confused about what they were saying. But it didn't end on Friday. Thank God it didn't end on Friday. And that's what made the change for the disciples, because those who were keeping their distance from the cross, remaining in the darkness because of their fear and their confusion, they were now stepping up to proclaim the gospel to people. They were not prepared to die for what they believed. In fact, they did. Every single one of them except John, young John, who ended up on the Isle of Patmos and wrote the book of Revelation. The other disciples, they all died for their faith and their belief in Jesus, not just because he died, but because he rose again from the dead. Their Messiah was now alive. He appeared to them. He spoke to them. He even made breakfast for them. And it changed everything for the disciples. I've often said that Friday was crucifixion day. Saturday was devil demolition day, because that's when Jesus descended into the devil's territory to take from him the keys of death and hell. And then return again to the tomb to once again enter that body that was lying in the tomb. Friday was crucifixion day. Saturday was devil demolition day. But Sunday was resurrection day, because death couldn't hold him. The devil couldn't hold him. The devil couldn't keep him back. All hell could come against him, but hell could not hold him. You'll all remember where this comes from. The Pharisees couldn't stop him. Pilate couldn't find fault in him. Herod couldn't kill him. Death couldn't handle him. And the grave couldn't hold him. And so thank God for the words of the hymn writer who said, death could not hold its prey. Jesus, my Savior, he tore the bars away. Jesus, my Lord, up from the grave he arose with a mighty triumph for his foes. He arose a victor from a dark domain, and he lives forever with his saints to reign. Come on, let's stand together, please. Let's stand. Let's just stand for a moment. Let's worship the Lord.